Mom, I think Ashley's the one.
Then you won't mind if I go clean her future house for the next 3 weeks without telling her.
Mum, are you joking? What are you saying?
I am not joking. I need to test her to be sure she's not like other girls that has broken your heart before.
By the end of this story, one overheard conversation in a garden will end an engagement in front of everyone. Stay with me, because you will never look at someone's smile the same way again. Before we dive in, if you love stories about family, pride, and karma finding its way home, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell on the comments section. Let's know where you're watching from, so you never miss our new stories every day. Let's begin. In the hills outside Denver, Colorado, there stood a mansion that people in town simply called the Doyle Place. 12 bedrooms, a marble staircase that curved like a wave frozen in mid-motion, and gardens so perfectly trimmed that neighbors joked the hedges were afraid to grow crooked. The man who owned it, Grant Doyle, was 38 years old and worth more money than most people could count in a lifetime. He had built a chain of private hospitals across 6 states, starting with nothing but a nursing degree, a small loan, and a stubborn refusal to accept impossible as an answer. But none of that mattered to him as much as one simple, painful fact. He had spent nearly 15 years falling in love with women who, in the end, seemed to love his bank account far more than they ever loved him. Margaret Doyle was 66 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and about as easy to fool as a bloodhound with a head cold. She had raised Grant alone after his father passed when the boy was only 9, working double shifts at a diner in a small Colorado town so he could have shoes without holes in them. She never had money. She never had luxury. What she had was patience, instinct, and a memory for how people treated her when they thought she was nobody. And Margaret had watched her son get his heart broken more times than any mother should have to witness. There had been Vanessa, years ago, back when Grant's hospitals were still small and struggling, who left him the very same month his first big loan fell through, telling him plainly that she hadn't signed up to date a man who might go broke. Margaret remembered the sound of her son's voice on the phone that night, flat and quiet in a way that frightened her more than crying would have. There had been Kimberly, 2 years later, who stayed through the good times but grew cold and distant the one month his company had a cash flow problem, disappearing entirely until the numbers recovered, only to reappear with a bouquet of flowers and an excuse about needing space, as though love came with a stock ticker attached. And there had been Sabrina, who Grant had actually proposed to once, the one Margaret still had the hardest time thinking about. 3 weeks before that wedding, Grant discovered that Sabrina had been quietly meeting with his accountant, asking detailed questions about prenuptial arrangements and life insurance policies in the same conversation, more curious about what she'd inherit than what kind of husband he'd be. That engagement ended in a single, quiet phone call, and Grant didn't speak about it for almost a year. Margaret had driven to his house every day that week with a casserole, and no questions, just her presence, sitting beside her son on the couch while he stared at a television that wasn't even turned on. Each time, Margaret had watched her son rebuild himself a little slower than the time before. Each time, she'd held her tongue about her suspicions until it was too late to matter, telling herself it wasn't her place to interfere in her grown son's love life. And each time, she'd sat across from him at her small kitchen table, while he quietly admitted that he wasn't sure anymore if any woman could look at him and see anything besides dollar signs. "Maybe I'm just built to be alone, Mom," he'd told her after Sabrina, staring into a cup of coffee he never drank. "Maybe that's just how this works out for men like me." Margaret had held his hand across that table and told him he was wrong, that somewhere out there was a woman who would love him exactly the way he deserved to be loved. But privately, driving home that night, she had made herself a quiet promise. If there was ever a next time, she would not simply hope for the best and wait to pick up the pieces afterward. She would find out the truth herself, before the wedding, not after. So when Grant came to her one spring evening, practically glowing, and told her he'd met someone named Ashley Bennett and intended to marry her, Margaret didn't celebrate right away. She smiled, she hugged him, she told him she was happy for him. But underneath, an old, tired alarm was already ringing, quiet but insistent. The kind of alarm that comes from watching the same story almost repeat itself too many times to ignore. Ashley was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful. Polished, careful, camera-ready even in a grocery store. She came from a family with old money in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of family that had never once worried about a light bill. When Grant introduced her to his mother over dinner at a restaurant so fancy the menu didn't list prices, Ashley had smiled with perfect teeth and said all the right things. "Oh, Mrs. Doyle, Grant talks about you constantly. I just know we're going to be so close." Margaret smiled back, polite and warm on the surface, while quietly running the same checklist she'd run 3 times before and failed to trust 3 times before. She noticed something small that night. When the waiter accidentally spilled a drop of water near Ashley's plate, the young woman's smile didn't just falter, it vanished entirely, replaced for half a second by something cold and sharp, before she caught herself and laughed it off as a joke. Margaret had spent 30 years reading people's faces in a diner where tips depended on it. She knew the difference between a woman who was naturally kind and a woman who had learned to perform kindness like a costume. The same costume Vanessa and Kimberly and Sabrina had each worn so convincingly for a while. Later that same dinner, Ashley asked, almost offhandedly between bites of her salad, "So Grant tells me the Denver hospital just expanded again? That must be worth an absolute fortune now." She said it lightly, laughing as she said it, but Margaret noticed she didn't ask a single question about the patients, the doctors, or why Grant had built the place at all. Only what it was worth. This time, Margaret decided she would not wait until the wedding invitations were already printed to find out the truth. This time, she would not simply hope her instincts were wrong and let her son walk into heartbreak a 4th time. She loved him too much to stand by quietly again. She said nothing to Grant about her doubts. Telling a man freshly, hopefully in love, that his mother distrusted his fiancé would only sound like the bitter suspicion of a woman who'd been burned watching her son get hurt too many times. And Grant, understandably tired of being told, "Be careful," might not listen anyway, might even accuse her of never being able to accept any woman he chose. So instead, Margaret decided to do something else. She decided to find out for herself, quietly, without anyone knowing who she really was, exactly the way she wished she had done years earlier, before Sabrina, before the quiet phone call that had left her son sitting silently on his couch for an entire evening. 3 weeks before the wedding, an ad went up for domestic help at the Doyle estate. Ashley had already moved in to get used to the house, as she put it, and she wanted the staff replaced with people she'd chosen herself, people who understood, in her words, how a home like this should really be run. Grant, wanting to make his fiancée happy, agreed to let her interview and hire the new cleaning staff. What Ashley did not know was that one of the women who showed up for the interview, wearing a plain gray dress, sensible shoes, and her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, introducing herself only as Peggy, was Grant's own mother. Margaret had thought this through carefully. She changed nothing about her appearance except her name and her posture. She let her shoulders slump slightly, softened her voice, and avoided any mention of her son. She had worked as a housekeeper decades ago, before the diner job, so the skills came back to her hands like an old song. When Ashley interviewed her in the kitchen, barely glancing up from her phone, Margaret answered every question with quiet humility. "Can you start Monday?" Ashley asked, still scrolling. "Yes, ma'am," Margaret said. "Whatever suits you." "Good. I don't want to deal with training anyone. Just do the job and stay out of the way when we have guests. And don't touch anything in Grant's home office." Actually, on second thought, Ashley paused, tapping her chin. "You can dust in there, but never move anything on his desk. I like to know exactly where his paperwork sits." Margaret filed that comment away carefully. A woman who wanted to always know exactly where her husband's financial paperwork sat was not a woman thinking only about love. "Of course, ma'am," Margaret said. And just like that, Margaret Doyle became Peggy the cleaner in her own son's house, determined this time to see the truth before the wedding, not after. The first week was quiet, almost disappointingly ordinary. Margaret scrubbed floors that were already spotless, dusted shelves that had never known a speck, and observed. She noticed Ashley rarely spoke to the household staff at all, unless giving instructions, treating Franklin, the groundskeeper who had worked for the Doyle family for nearly a decade, and Rosa, a young woman saving money for nursing school who helped with the laundry, as though they were furniture that occasionally moved on its own. One afternoon, Margaret watched Ashley take a phone call from one of her bridesmaids while sitting by the pool, laughing loudly enough to be heard from the kitchen window. "Oh my God, you would not believe this house, Brianna. There's an entire wing I haven't even used yet. I keep telling Grant we should build a guest house just for my parents, since apparently money is basically not a concept in this family." She laughed again, a bright, careless laugh, before adding, "Honestly, I could get used to this very, very easily." Margaret's hands, scrubbing a countertop that didn't need scrubbing, went still for a moment. Another evening, Margaret overheard Ashley on a call with someone from a bridal magazine, discussing the upcoming wedding feature. "The budget doesn't really matter," Ashley said breezily. "Grant's very generous. He'll cover whatever it costs. He always does." There was no mention of Grant himself in that sentence beyond his wallet. Not his kindness, not his sense of humor, not the exhausting hours he spent visiting hospital wards on weekends just to check on patients personally. Only his generosity, which in Ashley's mouth sounded less like a compliment and more like a resource to be managed. But Margaret reminded herself, again and again, that people can talk carelessly about money without necessarily being cruel underneath it. She needed more than a careless comment on a phone call. She needed to see what Ashley did when she believed absolutely nothing was being recorded, judged, or remembered, when there was truly nothing to gain from performing affection and truly nothing to lose from revealing the truth. That test came on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days before the wedding, when Grant's accountant, a soft-spoken man named Douglas Meyer, arrived at the mansion for what was supposed to be a brief, private meeting with Grant about adjusting some of his hospital investment accounts before the ceremony. Grant had asked Douglas to come by the house instead of the office, simply because his schedule that week was packed wall-to-wall with hospital visits, and Douglas didn't mind the drive. What neither Grant nor Douglas realized was that Ashley had specifically requested Margaret, still known to her only as Peggy, be assigned to clean the study that afternoon, the same room where the meeting would take place, in case anyone needs coffee or water. It was, on the surface, a reasonable request. It was also, Margaret suspected within the first 5 minutes, a deliberate excuse to be near the conversation herself. Grant, however, got pulled away almost immediately by an emergency call from one of his hospital administrators about a staffing shortage on the night shift, apologizing profusely to Douglas and asking him to wait 15 minutes in the study while he handled it in the hallway, his voice fading as he walked further from the room. That left Ashley alone with Douglas, and Margaret quietly dusting a bookshelf in the corner, invisible in the particular way household staff so often are to people who have never had to be one. "So," Ashley said, settling into the leather chair across from Douglas with the easy confidence of someone used to getting information simply by asking for it. "Since you're already here, Douglas, I've actually been meaning to ask you something. With the wedding coming up, I want to make sure everything's properly set up on my end too. What exactly would happen to the hospital shares if, heaven forbid, something ever happened to Grant down the road? Are those already structured to pass to a spouse, or would that need to be arranged separately after the wedding?" Douglas blinked, clearly caught off guard by the specificity and timing of the question. That's really something you and Grant should discuss together, along with legal counsel, closer to the ceremony. I'm not really able to—" Of course, Ashley said smoothly, waving a manicured hand as though she hadn't just asked a stranger about her fiancé's death 10 days before their wedding. "I just like to be organized, that's all. Grant's so busy with the hospitals, someone has to think about these things. What about the properties? Are those held jointly once we're married, or does he keep those separately structured too?" Douglas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ashley, I really think it's just curiosity," Ashley said, laughing lightly, the same bright, careless laugh Margaret had heard through the kitchen window days earlier. "Grant and I don't keep secrets from each other. I'm sure he'd tell me all of this himself if I asked him directly. I just thought, since you were here anyway." Margaret, dusting a shelf she had already dusted twice, felt her stomach twist into a cold, familiar knot. She had heard almost this exact conversation before, word for word in spirit if not in exact phrasing, sitting in her own memory from 3 weeks before Sabrina's wedding was supposed to happen. Different woman, different room, same quiet, careful excavation of a man's net worth disguised as simple curiosity. Grant returned to the study a few minutes later, apologizing again for the interruption, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place in his absence. Douglas, visibly relieved to change the subject, moved quickly into discussing the actual investment adjustments Grant had called him about, and Ashley, sensing the moment had closed, simply smiled and excused herself to let the men talk business, kissing Grant lightly on the cheek on her way out. Margaret waited until that evening, back in her small kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, to fully absorb what she'd witnessed. One overheard conversation with an accountant about inheritance and property 10 days before a wedding, phrased as harmless curiosity. It could, she told herself honestly, still be nothing. Grief-stricken imagination could turn an ordinary conversation into evidence of a crime that didn't exist. She needed to be certain, not just suspicious. She needed one more moment, ideally a bigger one, where the stakes felt real enough that the mask might slip entirely, in front of witnesses who would matter. She got that moment 5 days later, at the final wedding walkthrough. The walkthrough was held in the mansion's garden, where the ceremony itself would take place. Ashley had brought her wedding planner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Foster, along with her mother and 2 bridesmaids, including the same Brianna from the earlier phone call, to finalize every last detail. The flowers, the seating chart, the timeline, down to the minute. Margaret, still in her role as Peggy the cleaner, had been assigned to help set up folding chairs in the garden alongside Franklin and Rosa. The conversation started innocently enough, discussing centerpieces and floral arrangements, until Ashley's mother, a woman named Patricia Bennett who wore her sunglasses even in the shade, brought up the subject of the prenuptial agreement Grant's lawyers had drafted weeks earlier. "Have you had your attorney look over it properly, dear?" Patricia asked, sipping a glass of sparkling water a caterer had just delivered. "I still think it's far too restrictive. 15 years of marriage before certain assets fully transfer? That seems excessive for a modern marriage." "I know, Mom," Ashley said, lowering her voice slightly, though not nearly enough, given how close Margaret stood while adjusting a folding chair. "I already talked to my own lawyer about it privately. There might be a way to push for an earlier transfer date, if we frame it as protecting shared family assets, instead of just individual property. Grant's not exactly detail-oriented about paperwork. He trusts people too easily. I don't think he'll even notice the difference if the wording gets adjusted." Patricia laughed softly. "That's my girl. You always did know how to read the fine print better than anyone." Rosa, standing nearby folding linens, glanced quickly at Margaret with the kind of look service workers exchange when they've just overheard something they're not supposed to comment on. Margaret kept her hands steady on the folding chair, her face carefully neutral, but inside, something that had been suspicion for 3 long weeks finally hardened completely into certainty. "And honestly," Ashley continued, dropping her voice even further, though Margaret's hearing, sharpened by decades of listening carefully in a busy diner, caught every word clearly. "Between us, Mom, I do love Grant, I really do. But you have to admit, this whole situation worked out perfectly. A sweet, hard-working guy who happens to be worth more than every family in Charleston combined, who's so desperate to be loved for himself that he barely questions anything I tell him. I'd be an idiot not to make sure I'm protected properly before I sign anything." Patricia smiled behind her sunglasses. "As long as you actually like him enough to make it convincing, darling, that's really all that matters in the end, isn't it?" "Oh, I like him plenty," Ashley said, laughing lightly. "He's sweet. A little boring, honestly, always talking about his hospitals like they're his children. But sweet. I could do a lot worse for the lifestyle that comes with it." It was at that exact moment that Grant walked out through the garden's side door, having just finished a phone call about a hospital budget meeting and heard the last 2 sentences with painful clarity. He stopped in the doorway, completely still. Margaret, 20 feet away with a folding chair in her hands, watched her son's face change in real time, watched the color drain first, then rise sharply back into his cheeks, watched 38 years of quiet, hard-working dignity collide head-on with the exhausted, familiar ache of recognizing a pattern for the 4th devastating time. "A little boring," Grant repeated slowly, stepping fully into the garden. "But you could do a lot worse for the lifestyle." Ashley spun around so fast her champagne nearly spilled from her hand, her face flashing through shock, panic, and then the same fast recalibration Margaret had seen in 3 prior women who came before her. "Grant, how long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Grant said, his voice dangerously calm, carrying clearly across the now silent garden. Diane the planner suddenly found her clipboard fascinating. Rosa and Margaret stood frozen mid-task, chairs still in hand. Even the caterers near the drink table had gone quiet, sensing something in the air had shifted permanently. "Grant, that's not what it sounded like, I promise you," Ashley said quickly, setting her glass down with a trembling hand. "My mother and I were just joking around. That's all. We do that. We tease each other about everything." "You told your mother I was desperate to be loved for myself," Grant said, each word landing with quiet, devastating precision. "You told her I'm so trusting I wouldn't notice if my own lawyers changed the wording on my prenuptial agreement. You told her you could do worse for the lifestyle." Patricia, for the first time since Margaret had met her, seemed to have nothing clever to say, her sparkling water frozen halfway to her lips. "Grant, please," Ashley said, her voice cracking now, the panic finally breaking fully through the practiced calm. "You're taking a few sentences out of context. Every couple jokes about money sometimes. That doesn't mean—" "I built 6 hospitals from a small loan and a nursing degree," Grant said, "because I watched my mother work double shifts at a diner for 15 years, just so I could have shoes without holes in them. Every single dollar I have came from actual work, actual risk, actual years of showing up when it would have been easier to quit. And you just stood in my garden and called that a lifestyle you could do worse for. Like I'm a car you settled on because the price was right." "That's not fair," Ashley said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. "No," Grant agreed quietly. "It isn't. It isn't fair that this is the 4th time in 15 years I've had this exact conversation with a woman I was about to marry." It was at that moment that Grant's eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the woman standing quietly by the folding chairs in her gray cleaning uniform, silver hair pulled back, a woman he had walked past a dozen times that week without truly looking at, the way people rarely truly look at the staff quietly working around them. Something flickered across his face, a frown, a tilt of the head, the particular, dawning confusion of a man whose brain is telling him something impossible. "Mom?" he said. The word landed in the garden like a dropped glass. Ashley's head snapped toward Margaret so fast, her hair whipped across her shoulder. Diane's clipboard nearly slipped from her hands entirely. Patricia removed her sunglasses for the first time all afternoon, staring in open disbelief, and Margaret, caught at last, set her folding chair down slowly and let out a long, steady breath, the breath of a woman finally allowed to stop pretending. "Hello, sweetheart," she said quietly. Why are you dressed like?" Grant crossed the garden in long, urgent strides, his confusion tangled up with something close to alarm. "Mom, what is going on? Why have you been working here as a cleaner?" Margaret glanced once at Ashley, whose face had drained of every trace of its earlier polish, and then back at her son, her voice steady and clear enough for every person in that garden to hear. "Because I've watched you get your heart broken 3 times already, Grant, by women who loved what you could give them far more than they loved you. Vanessa, who left the moment the money got tight. Kimberly, who disappeared until it recovered. Sabrina, who asked your own accountant about your life insurance before she'd even picked her wedding dress. I sat across from you after every single one of those women and watched a piece of your confidence disappear a little more each time. I couldn't sit back and let it happen a 4th time without at least trying to learn the truth before the wedding, instead of after. You've been spying on me," Ashley said, her voice rising sharply, all pretense of composure abandoned now. "This whole time you've been spying on me." "I've been watching," Margaret corrected calmly, without raising her voice at all, which somehow made her words land harder than shouting would have. "There's a difference. Spying is sneaking around to catch someone doing something private and harmless. I was simply present, doing an honest job, listening to how you spoke about my son when you believed no one who mattered was in the room. And in 3 weeks, you never once said his name the way a woman says the name of someone she loves. You said it the way someone describes an investment they're managing carefully." "This is insane," Ashley said, her hands shaking now. "You lied to me. You lied to all of us, pretending to be some maid named Peggy." "I told one lie," Margaret said. "My name. Everything else, every task I did, every word I said to you, was exactly who I really am. A woman who works hard and doesn't think less of anyone for doing the same. You, meanwhile, told the truth about yourself every single day for 3 weeks straight, without ever realizing you were being tested. You simply didn't like the answer once it finally caught up with you in front of everyone. Grant stood very still for a long moment, looking between his mother and his fiancée, the woman he had genuinely believed, only 20 minutes earlier, might finally be the one who saw him instead of his balance sheet. "Grant, please," Ashley said, moving toward him, her voice cracking into something closer to real desperation now. "I made a mistake. People say careless things they don't mean around their own mothers. It doesn't mean I don't love you. Please, don't let one overheard conversation ruin everything we've built. I believe you love the life I can give you," Grant said quietly, stepping back half a pace, just enough to close the distance she'd tried to close herself. "I've heard that particular kind of love before, Ashley. 3 times, actually, from 3 different women, in 3 different ways. I'm not sure anymore that you love the people in it, and those 2 things have never once been the same, not even close. So that's it?" Ashley's voice climbed, sharp with panic now. "You're going to throw away an entire wedding because your mother decided to play dress-up as a housekeeper for 3 weeks. It wasn't 3 weeks of nothing," Margaret said firmly. "It was 3 weeks of watching you calculate exactly how much this family was worth to you before you'd even said your vows. It was watching you ask my son's accountant about his death 10 days before your wedding day. It was standing in this garden 5 minutes ago and hearing you tell your own mother that my son was a little boring but worth the lifestyle. None of that came from me, Ashley. Every single word of it came from you." Ashley opened her mouth to argue further, glancing toward her mother for support. But Patricia, for once, said nothing at all, sunglasses still in her hand, staring at the ground. Grant took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he's about to say something that will change the rest of his life. "I think," he said quietly, "we should call off the wedding. Permanently, this time." The word permanently hung in the warm afternoon air, like the final note of a song nobody wanted to hear the end of. Ashley left within the hour, her mother trailing behind her in stiff, humiliated silence, offering no apology to anyone as they climbed into their car and drove away from the mansion for the last time. The wedding, of course, never happened. Word moved quietly through their social circles over the following weeks, not because Grant or Margaret ever spoke publicly about what happened, but because Diane, the wedding planner, still stunned by what she'd witnessed firsthand, eventually mentioned it in confidence to another client, who mentioned it to someone else, until the story had traveled far beyond anyone's control. Grant threw himself into his work over the following months, visiting his hospitals more often than usual, sitting with patients, listening to nurses, remembering in a very real, very immediate way exactly why he had built this life in the first place. For the first time in 15 years, he also stopped quietly blaming himself for the string of failed relationships behind him. Sitting with his mother one evening at her small kitchen table, the same table where he'd once said maybe he was simply built to be alone, he finally said something different. "It was never about me being unlovable, was it?" he said, not quite a question. "No, sweetheart," Margaret said, covering his hand with her own. "It was never about you at all. You were just looking for love in a very small pool of women who only ever wanted the water around it." Margaret hung her gray cleaning uniform in the back of her closet, where it stayed for a long time afterward, a strange little souvenir of the 3 weeks she'd spent as Peggy. She never once regretted the decision. Some truths, she had come to believe, could only be found by stepping quietly out of your own life and watching how the world treated your son when it thought there was nothing to gain from pretending. Nearly a year later, Grant met a woman named Chloe Ramirez, a pediatric nurse working at one of his own hospitals in Denver, a woman who had no idea, for the first 3 months of dating him, that he owned the very building she worked in. She found out entirely by accident, from a coworker, and when she confronted him about it, nervous and a little embarrassed that she hadn't known, Grant only smiled and said, "I wanted you to get to know me first, before you knew what I had." When Margaret finally met her, there was no need for gray uniforms or fake names. She simply invited Chloe over for dinner one evening, and within 20 minutes, she understood everything she needed to know. Chloe asked about Margaret's years working at the diner, with genuine curiosity, not polite indifference. She asked Grant detailed questions about individual patients he'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier, remembering names and details most people would have long forgotten. When the subject of the hospitals came up, Chloe talked about the exhausted night shift nurses and the families in the waiting rooms. Never once about numbers, valuations, or what any of it was worth. "I like her," Margaret told Grant simply, washing dishes together in her small kitchen after Chloe had gone home that first evening. "I like her very much." "You didn't even test her," Grant said, half joking, half genuinely curious. "I didn't need to," Margaret said. "Some people show you exactly who they are within 20 minutes, if you're paying attention. It only takes 3 weeks with someone else to notice when they're hiding it." Grant and Chloe were married the following spring, in that same garden where the first wedding had never taken place. Margaret cried through most of the ceremony, and for once, nobody needed to wonder why. Here's what this story really comes down to, friends. Money can buy a beautiful dress, a perfect venue, a flawless smile for the cameras. It cannot buy character. The way a person talks about someone when they believe absolutely no one who matters is listening tells you everything you will ever need to know about who they truly are underneath the performance. Grant spent nearly 15 years believing something was fundamentally wrong with him, when the truth was simply that he hadn't yet found a way to see past a beautiful smile to what was underneath it. His mother finally gave him that chance, at real personal cost to herself, because she loved him enough to risk his anger in order to save him from a fourth heartbreak. So here's a small piece of advice, if you'll allow an old story to offer it. The next time you're deciding whether to trust someone completely, don't just listen to how they talk to you. Listen to how they talk about you when they think you can't hear them. That's where the real person is always hiding, whether they know they're being watched or not. And if you've been hurt before by someone who only wanted what you had rather than who you are, know that it was never a reflection of your worth. It was only ever a reflection of theirs. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or maybe even reminded you to trust your own instincts a little more, let us know in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you.
Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and support me. Thank you so much. I love you all. Bye!